Cool. We are rolling. Mr. James Ford, what's the word?
Not much, man. Maintaining. That's the word. Maintaining. How about you?
I'm sure you are doing more than that. Good, man. Healthy and employed. Happy. Appreciate you joining. Long time coming.
Yeah, man. Yeah, yeah. Good to see you making moves and whatnot, man. So I'm just glad to be a guest. You know what I mean,
Oh,
in the
stop it.
house.
Gonna go off script already, but want to give you even more love and also the audience. But appreciated the perspective and knowledge you dropped Saturday with Tekka and Diaries at the virtual conference with Diverse Ed. Thought that was great.
Thanks, man. Yeah, Darius and Tekka, man. That's I meant what I said. Like their family, and
Mm-hmm.
we just feel certain kinship between Creed and Tekka, and I was happy to let me get on there behind Brittany Packnett Cunningham. I mean, that's a hard act to follow, bro.
Well, I was going to say, like you said, you didn't do yourself any favors going after her. If anything, you got to go front and introduce the closer, right?
Nah. I was just happy to have my name on the marquee at the end of the day. But that was good fun, man. Hopefully
Sure.
somebody learned something in the process.
Yeah, it was really good, and hopefully some of the folks listening here today got a chance to see it. All right, before we get into some of the day to day, I think you're a semi proud Midwesterner, as I am. A little different that you reside from, I believe, a city called Rockford.
That is
Um,
correct.
Also, might share some of those roots with a semi famous basketball player now in the NBA. So I think, an unbiased question, James, you or Fred VanFleet is the most famous and influential historian or maybe just person from Rockford?
Um, so right now I'll say it's Fred without
Okay.
question, and justifiably so. Quick story: Fred was a freshman, man. Fred and I got the same alma mater.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, a student taught at my alma mater when he was a freshman. So Fred was hooping. I think he was on the varsity squad at Auburn High School in Rockford.
Mm,
When I was student teaching, and his coach um, is Brian Ott. Shout out to Brian, Coach
okay.
Ott. An amazing teacher, man. On top of all of that, and so
Wow.
I just respect it. But right now I give it to Fred. But to be honest, man, Virgil Abloh, Virgil right, up there too.
Mm-hmm.
Louis Vuitton fame, and
Yep.
so you got to give it to both of those cats. But I'm really proud of Fred, and he's doing it the Midwestern, blue collar way. You know what I
Yep.
mean? Nothing given to you, just working hard.
That's right. Yeah, it's cool. I mean, I don't think Rockford, I know the population off the top of my head, but I think fairly small, right? But being able to see just different people you grew up with and in the community kind of blossom and grow and develop, it's cool to see that both in your hometown and in other networks as well.
You know how it is. I mean, you from Toledo, right? You know what I mean? So
Sir.
it's so Rockford's about 150,000. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And the Midwest, bro. The Midwest is like all the Midwest for the most part. Is like, I mean, I won't say struggling, but
Yeah, it's real.
it's gritty. You know what I mean? And
Mm-hmm.
so anytime you see somebody make it out of there, you can't help but root for them. I rooted for the Cavs when they won
Good
their
for you.
championship. You know what I
Good.
mean? Because
Appreciate
you love to
that.
see it, man. You know.
Knew I liked you. Yeah. Over the Pacers, or I guess the Bulls, right? Um, yeah, man, Cavs were good. It's good to see, when those things can come together, especially Cleveland. I don't really grow up a Browns fan, but going to school over there and just seeing how much love and passion they have, and also like how bad they've been for so long, it's hard not to pull for teams like that, particularly in like your, areas of the country in which you grew up, and also just friends in which you have kinship with.
That's right. That's right. It's a mentality, bro. Underdog, and I like to think that I embody that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
I
So
like that. So to talk us a little bit about music too, before we get into some of the day to day, I think, I know you're an avid fan of the Square Pizza, so we appreciate that. Number one. Number two, we don't call this, we call it like professional stalking / research to make sure we're doing good due diligence on our esteemed guests like yourself. But it appears both from some, album covers I've seen, as well as just following you on Twitter. Music is a big influence in your life, so I get it may or may not be something people know about you. So would love for you to confirm or deny that and perhaps tell the people more.
absolutely. So I mean, first and foremost, I'm a product of hip hop culture. Like
Okay.
like I was blessed to grow up in the era right as it was burgeoning.
Yep.
Right. So born in 1980, year after the first recorded song, Sugar Hill Gang, Rapper's Delight.
There you go.
Watched it develop. Was there through what I consider the golden years. So, I mean, it's part of my identity. You know what
Mm.
I mean? but beyond that, I MC, man.
Yep.
Like I
So I
did
saw.
underground semi-professional career. Um, Pretty much, did performances from the age of 13.
Hmm.
I didn't stop till like 29. Like
Yeah.
once I moved to Charlotte, I was like, I should probably get this up and focus on being a teacher. Uh, but no, so like it's a huge influence. But on top of that, just got a huge record collection. Was a
Yep.
old sample producer, boom bap head, and
Hmm.
still rely on music, man, just to take me to different places, and can't imagine life without it.
And did you grow up in a house that valued it, or there was always music around? How did you kind of dip your toe into music?
Yeah, big time. So my dad's an old jazz head. And
Okay.
so I grew up with records, man. And I recall, him always on Saturday mornings just sitting around, with a can of old Milwaukee, you know what I mean? Feet kicked up on it. You know what I
Talk
mean?
about Midwest right there.
I'm just
Talk,
trying to tell
shout
you,
out
bro.
to the Midwest.
It's not a game. We thought I was just playing. Like and just sitting there listening to jazz records. And you couldn't talk to him during that period. He would just zone out. And I began to develop that love. And like most hip hop producers, I would go through his crates and look at the artists. When I saw Bob James, um, and I heard, the album Two,
Yep.
right? And Take Me to Mardi Gras. And then when I heard, Peter Piper by Run DMC, I was like, my dad has, I know these, you know what I mean? Like I
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
these, so it was like, it felt like it was just natural
That's
growing
cool.
up in that household. Yeah.
Do you think like music, the creation of music, the MC skills translator had any influence? I guess influence is probably a bad way to put it. It's probably an obvious answer, but maybe a better phrase is like, how might have that experience with music influence what you're doing now and what you have done in education?
Yeah. That's an excellent question, right? Especially like with folks like Chris Emden who are,
Hmm.
drawing easy connections, through
Yep.
hip hop ed. Um, I mean, so there's hip hop itself, man, is a response to, oppression and, being under resourced, and it's an innovative response, making something out of nothing. So,
Yep.
so that's in me. But on top of that, like just as an MC, the stage presence, the ability to be extemporaneous,
Yep.
to be impromptu, to move the crowd, right? To have command
That's right.
of the stage and of the microphone. As a teacher, that was always, something that I did,
Yep.
and I, it's the craft, man. Like you
Sure.
respect, right?
Yep.
I respect good teaching in the same way. Like I like seeing a teacher really go at it. I'm like, man, they're dope. I feel the same way about MCing. So it's just about being true to the craft at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, just thinking about one, whether you're freestyling or making beats or anything else, just thinking on your feet, being able to move quickly, both like for the music and the tunes and everything else, but translating back to the classroom, same thing. If something happens in the classroom, and or you think about stage presence, like I think one of the best things I ever learned is like maybe if you're losing sight of your lesson and or students are losing interest, like that presence in the classroom, like stand in front of the classroom, plant your feet, make eye contact with your students, make sure you like wait and then keep it moving to the next thing. Performance art may be a bit too much, but since you and I are both education fiends, I think we might be allowed to use that terminology here today.
Well, first of all, you talking like you know something about that, man. You know what I mean? Like you've been on the stage or something. But no, I couldn't agree more. And I do think it is a performance, to an extent, right? When
Yeah,
it's done
sure.
well, you allow autonomy or whatever. But yes, it is art. It is a production. It
Mm-hmm.
is it is a craft, and you got to have presence. And the students, they feel that. They know when
That's
you're
right.
into it. So I would agree.
Yeah, that's cool. So, I mean, we could probably go deep dive there and maybe that will, but we always like to start with kind of what's top of mind with our guests. And so without me talking too much, we'd love to just hear kind of where you go with that.
Yeah. So, I mean, naturally, we talked about it today. I was on, had the opportunity to be on Charlotte Talks
Yep.
to discuss a little bit more of the work going on at the state board level,
Yep.
or that happened at the state board level around standards. And I'm encouraged by this moment, man, where we really get to think about education as a practice of freedom, right, and
Yep.
critical pedagogy. And I mean, what does a world look like that really responds to the needs and to the experiences and affirms the identities of students, and obviously standards, how they translate to curriculum, how that impacts what's taught and how it's taught in the classroom. That excites me, man.
Yep.
And I can't imagine being a kid who would have had the opportunity to learn more about myself
Yep.
when I was younger.
Yeah, and shout out to you and everybody that had a part of that. And I think I want to drill down on and lift you guys up in the sense of, it's one thing to pass standards by themselves, whether it's Common Core or literacy, just in like updating the standards. And we always hear things around why wasn't this taught in school, whether it's personal finance or taxes or something else, like just the actual passage of policy. And something you said this weekend about understanding where the power lies or perhaps resides in order to change that power is like kind of pillar one. But then pillar two, to do it, in a state that has not been known well for focusing on equity and supporting, all people the way they should be supported in an equitable way, but then implementing social studies standards in that way too, to ensure some of those tough conversations, but real conversations, the history of our country are taught. Those two things are not easy to do policy wise. And so kind of want to put it back to you and talk us like, how did that happen? How did you guys make that work in that tough policy environment?
Oh, man, so North Carolina is interesting.
Yep.
The interesting thing, and I think most listeners who live in NC would agree, is, I mean, NC could really, really be great. I mean, if it weren't so, how to say it, like gerrymandered, right?
Sure.
That's a fact.
Yep.
We're probably the most moderate in terms of split down the middle, moderate state in the union. And so
You believe that?
I do too. Well, maybe
That's interesting.
Virginia at
Yeah.
this point,
Yeah.
but I mean, at this point, Virginia's kind of more reliably, blue or whatever. But
Sure.
um, North Carolina is they're great people here, man,
Yep.
and you find yourself with strange bedfellows, as I was kind
Mm.
of talking about when it came to TECA.
Yep.
And so conversations around equity principally are those that most people can get behind. I won't say all.
Mm-hmm.
And so when people get lost in sort of terminology and stuff that turns them off, you have to take time to like slowly educate them on what you mean when you say this, right? So when I'm talking about all kids, right, getting what they need, you have to explain that like different kids have different needs because they're differently positioned. And
Yep.
when you're seeing these outcomes, it ain't based on what a kid is capable of, right? It's understanding how they got to where they're at. And then once you are able to rally around certain principles, it's been a 2-year process, right?
Right.
We're being honest, right? You can start to corral folks, and people become more naturally open to the possibility of responding to a state that is objective and verifiably different. You
Yep.
know what I mean? And
Yep.
changing.
Yep.
So I think it takes a lot of education. It takes some fight too. You gotta be able to take some shots. I ain't gonna lie to you. You know what I
Yep.
mean? You got to take,
I mean, it wasn't smooth sailing to pass curriculum like that in the state in North Carolina like that.
No,
Yeah.
and it is political, bro. I
Right.
mean, and so you just got to know that going into it's a contact sport. You take your hits and you
Yep.
keep moving your feet.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's good and so important. If we like go from policy to practice, and so what's just like the practicality of standards being passed? We're obviously talking about this, which is important, but it happens, the teacher in the classroom or the eighth grader that's now going to be able to be delivered this content. What does just that process look like for those that maybe aren't familiar with that process?
Yeah, that's a good question too. So standards deal with pretty plainly put what we want students to know,
Mm-hmm.
right? And curriculum, which is populated at the local level, typically by your district and by the teacher, is how you want students to know it. So the delivery, the materials, the text, the resources, et cetera, that's something that still is going to remain within the autonomy of the instructor.
Yep.
But because we can't reach down and say to every teacher, nor should we, you need to teach like this. So this is how you teach it.
Right.
What you can do is at the policy level say, well, this is what we want students to know, right? No more 10, 15 down the line coming down and saying, well, I didn't know about the American Indian movement, or I didn't know about Black Wall Street or
Yep.
the Wilmington coup, right? We can specify and say, listen, teachers, how you do it, how you populate it is up to you. But our expectation is that students who come through North Carolina public schools are educated about X, Y, Z. And so it translates into, still teachers and instructors being given carte blanche, but
Yep.
knowing that they got to justify their objectives according to those standards.
And this is ninth, like high school curriculum, K through 12. What are we looking at?
It's K-12, man.
K-12.
All the standards got revised that fall under the auspice of social studies.
And can be expected to be in front of students 21, 22
21,
school year,
22.
this upcoming
Yeah.
August. So
Yeah,
soon.
that's why we had to move, man. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? We had already delayed it. So yeah, they gotta be ready to go next school
And I
year.
think even more shout out to you guys of getting it passed, but then knowing one, everything that everybody is dealing with this school year, but two, having the vision with like an implementation idea and plan in place to know that it's not going to sit on the shelf for 2 more years, that we can get this in front of kids ASAP because that's what they deserve.
Yeah, well, it ain't just me for sure. And let
Yep.
me pause to say, like, shout out to the, to the folks at DPI, to the
Hmm.
teachers who volunteered,
Mm,
right, to dedicate their time to writing these standards and responding to the needs of the community. They deserve the lion's share of all the praise for sure.
that's great. I appreciate that. And I think kind of sticking with the standards, interested in kind of your insight. It's not really something we talked about before, but I think the idea of standardized tests
Mhm,
this year, and I think from from my previous experience, they can be used to inform. They can be
mhm.
used to judge if they're not used in the right way. They can be used to discriminate if they're not used in the right way. So in terms of there's data in general, and then data in the time of a school year during COVID, just interesting in like as a person and a human, where are you thinking this year?
Yeah, man, I've been evolving on that. I'm not gonna lie to you. So this is me
Yeah.
being vulnerable. Um, at first I was like, so you probably know, like, I don't even believe in grades
Right.
at this point of my career.
Can you give people, I know it's not a 30-second response, but can you maybe give people a high level of like, if that's the first time they ever heard, like this dude doesn't believe in grades, he's teacher year, like what's my man talking about?
Yeah, so this is my reasoning because most adults, y'all don't get grades. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Right? At your job, assuming you're not self-employed, and even if you are, your team, I
You get
imagine they
grades, but in a different,
evaluate.
yeah, you get grades, but in a different form. If you get fired,
Right.
you get told no, those are
That's
the
right.
grades, right?
You get a performance evaluation, and it's
That's right.
based. All it does is focus on what you're doing well,
Yep.
and what you need to work on. And so the notion of grades, I think, is a false one. If we focus on mastery, that kind of more aligns with how the real world is set up,
Yep.
and competency-based learning. So that's that. But I was dead set against students being tested during this year because I was like, man, what is this really going to measure?
Yep.
At the same time, I do kind of come from the school where it's like, dag, students who have been left behind pre-pandemic, you and there are folks who are like this. They don't feel like we should assess it. Like they cater to the argument. Well, nothing's really measurable. You can't measure a good teacher. You can't really
Right.
measure a kid. Reform by all means the metrics and the tools that are used, but we got to figure out on mass where kids are at, because
Yep.
like that's also like a dereliction of duty. But at the same time, standardized test, does that accomplish that? And I
Mhm.
think there's an argument to no, they don't, right? And who are they normed after, and what do they really tell us? And so I'm of the belief at this point, like, man, we got to figure out something. And
Mhm.
just leaving it totally to the teachers leads to so much variance
Yep.
that it doesn't tell us much. But relying 100% on standardized tests and putting high stakes to that in a pandemic,
Yep.
like, how reliable is that? Why would anybody do that? So
Right.
I think a temperature check is in order, but
Yep.
I don't think bringing kids into the school building to do that during a pandemic is necessarily the best way to do that either.
And has there been an official declaration about the expectation for that in the state?
No. So, we appealed to the Biden administration, well, initially to the
Yep.
Trump administration and now to the Biden administration for waivers, as you may have heard. That's been turned down. The expectation is that states still administer
Mhm.
standardized tests. A lot of pressure though,
Sure.
and I'm assuming, it's my prediction. I think that they'll end up moving on that
Yep.
by the time the school year ends. But who knows, man? This whole environment is precarious as heck.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think you're probably right as well, and I think yeah, would co-sign all of that. Um, and just right, it's always gray. Well, not always, but I think a lot of times gray, and that they can be used for good and maybe cannot be used for good. But at least knowing where students stand, even if perhaps we're using a system that's inequitable and a scale that's inequitable, it gives us an understanding of how to pivot, knowing we can't just go to no grades as a system tomorrow. And so you never want to kind of make these sacrifices in a sense, but this allows us to give some sort of resemblance of how to best support kids directly where they are.
Yeah, I mean, you can switch things overnight. That sounds great, but in the interim, like, I do think we're gonna find out that there's a lot of damage done, and more than we can properly measure. And I just
Yep.
don't want to wait till 20 years down the line and be like, oh, look at these outcomes. Like, that's a lagging indicator, and
That's right.
I don't believe in that.
Might there be any momentum across the state of North Carolina or others to begin to just get rid of grades down the road?
I think there is, and here's where the strange bedfellows argument comes in. So
Sure.
this is a and I'm not a partisan, as you know, like, I'm
Mhm.
unaffiliated. I'd be on everybody back. Um, but I mean, I'm certainly more left. I'm pretty far left, right?
Yep.
But a lot of conservatives, I think that they're open to the idea of competency-based learning as well. So that's one of those areas where you find intersection, that people are open to the idea
Yep.
of moving in a different direction. So there's pockets of support. Whether that translates into a real movement, yeah, I don't know.
And I think when you think about it, unfortunately, it's one of the things that almost makes too much sense in an antiquated system like public education in terms of, to your point, performance reviews and grades, but also just like team projects. Like very few working professionals are completely solo and not reliant on their team building skills, their soft skills, and frankly, like not their ability to balance fractions or to understand Pythagorean theorem or other things, even smaller things like best practices in writing short emails compared to long ass emails that nobody reads, right? Like those are things that seem too simplistic, but like maybe that's an indicator of success as a young professional. And so to this point around like not grades, it to the maybe personality education, it seems crazy, but I think there might be a growing population saying like it makes sense.
Maybe there are domains, right? Like that's what I hear you
Sure.
saying. It's like, yeah, okay, have you mastered this content? Cool.
Yep.
But like, okay, also like EQ. What's your EQ, right? IQ is
Mhm.
not the determinant who's successful most of the
For sure.
time. Mostly it's EQ. So do we come up with EQ domains, right?
Hmm.
Do we come up with anti-racist or culturally relevant domains?
Yep.
Like how do people navigate that as we, traverse along this multiracial democracy, this
Yep.
experiment?
Sounds like we're going to add some more to your plate before the end of the chat, as always. But I think you're already doing maybe not specifically around getting rid of grades at the moment, but certainly pushing the state and educators and leaders in the state and outside the state around issues of equity, around how to make sure we become a more equitable culture with your work at Creed, with you and Janine and the board and the rest of the team. Would love to hear what's top of mind for you there and what you want to share with the audience about the important work you guys are doing.
Yeah, so I mean, and so for folks who don't know, CREED is a creative acronym for the Center for Racial Equity and Education. The ED is for Ed. And me along with my co-founder Janine Bryant, we're educators, man. We both taught in Charlotte Mecklenburg schools. Janine taught early grades, I taught secondary. And I mean, our primary focus, man, is centering students of color, man, and
Mhm.
transforming the education system. We're not engaged in the ed reform business. We're about transformation, right? Going totally exploding the form that we're in, writing and cutting across and
Why
being
is that
interdisciplinary.
differentiation important? I know you're an intentional dude and use that reform differently from the word you just used. So curious for our listening audience why you choose to do that.
Listen, because there's a whole era that's been characterized by that term ed reform. And I would argue that, despite maybe some good intentions, it hasn't really been successful. And so we wanted
Cool.
to intentionally distance ourselves from that. And then also like this idea of transformation
Yep.
is something that, particularly when it comes to systems, is something that we really identify with. And so we chose our language carefully.
Yep.
We do that three ways: through research.
Hmm.
So folks are familiar with our rigorous research that calls out the intersections of race and ed, a really diverse engagement strategy, and then implementation. And so lately, what we've been focusing on is our our engagement. Started out the cannon with research, kind of
Yep.
brought to the forefront the issue and justify why we care about it. And now we're just like about, we're not a think tank. So we are a research to practice
There you
organization. And
go.
so we're trying to close the knowing doing gap. So engaging the general public and stakeholders is what we're involved in. So Freedom Hill Coalition,
Hmm.
named after Freedom Hill, the first community of formerly enslaved folks in
Yep.
America, is about taking our findings and going to community and saying, communities of color, say, what are your needs in the education sphere as it pertains to racial equity? And grassroots movement and empowering those folks, right? Not empowering, shall I
Right.
say, but you know, uh, uh, allowing folks and arming them with
Yep.
the information to hold policymakers accountable for their kids, right? Their
Yep.
community's education. And so we've been convening virtually, even in the COVID era, man.
Sure.
Still trying to mobilize folks across all 8 regions of the state. That's been exciting. And then most recently, we announced some work we're going to be doing in the post-secondary space because
Mm.
we're a P20 organization. So we
Yep.
focus on pre-K and post-secondary. So HBCUs, the NC10, which are the 10 HBCUs in North Carolina.
Yep.
We'll be
Saw
spending the
that.
year listening
Congrats
and
on that
learning to them.
announcement. Yeah.
Appreciate that, man. So it's going to be a packed year, but yeah, we staying busy.
Yep. I mean, it's great for a number of reasons. One, want to co-sign the love for the word implementation you chose to use for all the obvious reasons. We can talk ourselves in circles in education, other things without actually getting to the front lines of the school building. So appreciate you guys for that. And also, like you talked about centering minority students and Black children, which I think is important for a number of reasons we talked about in this podcast. But kind of related, I think, is the hopefully an emerging focus we've seen in some of our work, but also across the country around Black male educators and the importance of Black male educators. And not asking you because it's certainly not a monolith, but asking you because of your experience and what you've seen as more districts, as more states are thinking about supporting the community, the recruitment, the development, the retention of Black male educators, and knowing it's not a silver bullet. What are some promising practices you want to offer up, or just that you've seen?
Well, one is I think that the issue has raised, it has been raised to an extent now where it's kind of hit critical mass.
Mm,
And listen, folks could say, well, people known that a long time ago, but there are circles, as you know, man, where folks don't
sure.
understand the relevance of the issue. So
Yep.
with the Governor's Drive Task Force,
Mm-hmm.
and I forget the acronym, but it was
Yep.
focused on diversifying the teacher workforce,
Sure.
and the conference that was had in 2019 that raised the specter of the issue, and the recommendations that came out of that are really, really exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, the Performance and Evaluation Division of the General Assembly,
Mm.
right, nonpartisan group, focused on the teacher diversity issue as well. And so I
Yep.
think that there's enough momentum now where folks are going to start to pay careful attention to how do we really do more than just talk about it. On top of that, education preparation programs, EPPs.
Yep.
I don't know if you saw the accountability framework that was adopted for them. Diversity was part of the accountability framework now.
Yep.
So who comes through the program, what proportion of folks are folks of color, first gen, college goers, etc. That's going to be part of their what they're held accountable for in their rating. And so we're starting at a systems level to see ways that that can actually change. It'd be
Yep.
my hope that we could go the way that Tennessee just went and pass a policy that mandates every school district implement an educator diversity plan. What are you going to do,
That's right.
at local education agency, to ensure that we're going beyond just platitudes and really finding ways to recruit and develop more teachers of color, because
Yep.
we know that that impacts outcomes.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, two potential follow-ups, like 100% to Diaries in Tennessee and the work of Tech and their stakeholders and Ed Trust. I think one just around bringing relevance, but accountability, right? Because so many times you have these conversations, and yes, it's multifaceted in the system, but a district could pass it on to another LEA, or that could be passed up to the state, and it could be passed up to the Fed. So friendly accountability, we should say, looks appreciated, I would say. But to your point around certification tests and almost going back to standardized tests where we started, I think we've seen some research around if they are effective measures of teaching, as well as how they potentially discriminate against those moving into teaching forces, that people that don't look like me as a white male in the space trying to be a teacher. So, we've seen work with Sharif and Pennsylvania, almost talking about what if we get rid of the praxis? What if we get rid of state certified tests? And not really sure if you want to respond to that or care to, but I think it's emerging research that could be interesting as like a serious potential blocker for equitable access to teaching positions.
Yeah, I mean, so again, this is a really nuanced point, and hopefully
Yeah.
we're not getting too wonky for the folks out there. But what you're saying is accurate. I mean, it seems like on its face, like, oh, well, everybody should take a test to get certified and prove their acumen in this
Mm-hmm.
field. But again, tests are normed based
Sure.
on certain cultural practices and ideologies, and
Yep.
so those praxis tests, EdTPA also, oftentimes there's significant barriers. Now the argument always is, well, if we can diversify, but we can't lower the quality of teachers. And it's a license to practice, right?
Sure.
So we both got driver's licenses, but that doesn't tell you what kind of driver I am, right?
Especially if
That's
you come from the Midwest where the best drivers are compared
yeah.
to the South where they did.
These are some of the nicest drivers ever. I want dog.
All right, I'll
The
take the heat.
folks
I'll
that,
take the heat. That's
right.
fine. That's
You can
fine.
get your turn signal on here. You can switch 5 lanes. But what I'm saying is, these licenses to practice are very similar. They don't speak to quality, so stop using them to measure something they're not designed for,
Yeah.
right? And so, promising, I think evolving practice is wearing my state board hat. This human capital pipeline work that
Yep.
was announced, which is trying to create more of a funnel, a wider entrance to the profession, and they're looking at ways that folks can on ramp in, non-traditional ways, which tends to be the pathways that a lot of teachers of color come into the profession.
Yep.
They create, ways to get over those hurdles.
I mean, one, two, and just for context, like again, a bit more biased here, but I am one of two. Maybe you don't want to speak for you, but I failed the praxis the first 2 times I took it, and then think I was a okay teacher, at least with some of the data results we had. But also, like upon reflection, one could argue the theory that is asked and the content that is asked is still important. You don't want to put anybody in front of kids; they don't have the content to serve them. But there's a big jump between understanding earth and environmental science standards and leading and engaging and inspiring, if you will, 90 high school students, 90 minutes a day, 3 times a day. And maybe those skill sets can't be put on paper, but if that is true, then we as a system need to figure out how we get closer to that rather than, having maybe a practical conversation around like just doing well on the certification test and then like you're straight for the rest of your life in terms of teaching well.
Yeah, I mean, and so two things. One is we need to do a better job of evaluating that, right? Because that doesn't always show up on the accountability pieces for teachers as
Yep.
well. And two, like you said, man, you might could pass a test that says you have this content knowledge, but depending on which school you're in, that'll impact your effectiveness too. Because when
Sure.
I taught at Garinger, I declared that there were teachers in Charlotte who could not do what we did
Sure.
with the student populations, right? And frankly, it was a different skill set, right? It
Yep.
was social emotional, it was
Sure.
cultural, and I could go to other places perhaps and teach, but we always said, man, you can't just send anybody here to do this job. You got to really
Yep.
know, you got to come out your trick bag,
It's 100% true. And I mean, where we started the conversation, but like if teaching really is an art, which I think a lot of people would agree with, can you really measure and certify art through a certification test? I don't think our friends in the music business or our friend in the art business would want to necessarily sit down for a formal test to say, look, my test says I'm straight. I'm an artist. Like I don't know if those are fair comparison points.
Yeah, it's art and science, right? So maybe
Yep.
some aspects, but you gotta make room for the art.
Yeah, that's great. All right, man, we're going to get you out of here. Maybe a sideball question, but going to ask you, you get asked a lot of questions. You're a famous dude. You're an important dude. What's a question nobody asks that you wish people would?
Um, boy, okay, it's for a speed round. Um, I would say, well, one is the music question, so I appreciate you asking that.
Sure.
But like, what would I have done if I wasn't a teacher? Right? I tell everybody I didn't go to school to be a teacher. I went to school to be a journalist, man. So if I wasn't teaching
Could see that.
and if I wasn't rapping, I probably would have been in the journalism business.
Specific to education, music journalist, Rolling Stone.
I probably would have been doing some investigative stuff, man. You
Cool.
know what I mean? I would have been exposing things. Probably the same spirit of what I'm doing now, exposing systems.
There you go.
You know,
I mean, not that you have a lot of free time, but I could see almost like a little side hustle with a pseudo name coming up here soon.
thought about it, but yeah, I ain't got time, bro.
One thing the listening audience can do to help support your work or just public education across the country.
For our work, please visit creed-nc.org. We're a nonprofit organization, which means, man, we depend on the generosity of
There you go.
folks and stakeholders, man, to stay running. So there's that. Two is one thing you could do immediately is start asking, pick an issue, any issue that you care about in education, and automatically ask yourself, where does the power live? Who is the decision maker on that issue? And go find out. Do you know who's on the state board? Do you know what the state board does? Who's in your local board, right? Who is in the General Assembly? Who's on the education committees? Just spend 15 minutes doing that on the internet.
Yeah, so important for a number of reasons. I think you mentioned it this weekend too, but one, that info is not always easy to find, but two, once it is findable, picking not a lane, but picking a core focus area to drive change, going deeper rather than wider, I think is a great idea as well. And to what you said about Creed, nobody listening, important to know a nonprofit that doesn't make money goes out of business. And so that is important to support these organizations that are doing more work than a lot, I would say. So some are and some aren't. So let's say it that way. Square pizza. What does square pizza remind you of, James Ford?
Reminds me of the old Little Caesars commercials, bro.
Okay.
Like from
good.
the 80s, man, and from the Midwest. So I never really liked the deep dish,
Yep.
it's instant heartburn, but it does remind me of that, all that sauce, man, on that pie.
So the follow-up here that we've learned to ask, was it served in school at Rockford?
Heck yeah, but not the
Okay.
kind we're talking about. It was like square rectangular pizza, shall we
Right.
say. The cold joint that you put on the grill and just warm up, but we used to eat it.
We thought, like it was too late to change it from square pizza to rectangle pizza after we already launched. But also, like, you never really hear anybody call it a rectangle pizza, even though damn well it is a rectangle. It's just whatever default is like been in our system as a community or a culture as square pizza, even though it's damn well not square.
You know what we talking about. Don't be trying to be that. Don't be that guy. Don't be that well actually guy.
We're gonna keep it rolling. James Ford, we appreciate you.
Hey, appreciate you, man. Thanks for having me.